This is a recording from my fall 2020 webinar series.
Today I want to talk about the SEAM model, which is a model I actually started developing in 2014, 2015. I developed it based on my observations and my research as a way to help companies move towards greater effectiveness, both in terms of people and profit. The people part is closer to my heart. And if you pay attention to the people part, the profit part will also generally come with it. So I first used this as a way to make sense of what I was seeing on the team level in organizations. I often get called in because teams are not delivering as people hope they will, or because things aren't working well on the teams. And very often, it's not necessarily what's going on with the team itself. It's some other factors outside the team, and sometimes way outside the team, that's influencing what actually is going on in the team. So that's how I originally developed it. It was kind of a diagnostic for me to help me make sense of and help me communicate to other people what was going on in their organization. And over time, I started using it more in a dialogic sort of way. So when I was working with a company and they were trying to improve their effectiveness, we would use this as a way to focus people on the work to be done and how they could support both the part and the whole of the organization, rather than focusing on their traditional way of thinking about their job. So, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But it gives importance to all parts of the organization. It recognizes that you need all of the organization to be working well in order to deliver products and services. And it doesn't do that hierarchical thing about sort of devaluing, in the pyramid shape where, you have the people at the top and the people at the bottom. And metaphorically, that always implies status. So it works to put importance on all levels of the organization. I think about this in terms of three sets of concerns that exist in any company, whether it's a public company or a private company, whether it's 5 people or 50,000 people. These are just concerns that exist in every organization. So the first have to do with, why are we here? What difference are we trying to make in the world? What products are we delivering? What services? What relationship do we want to have with our customers? The who are we questions. How do we treat our employees? How do we treat our customers? How do we want to be in the world? These exist for every company. The second set of concerns have to do with, how do we accomplish that why? And now that we're doing it, how can we get even better at it? So this is the sort of operational aspect of it. And the third set of concerns has to do with, how do we actually create our products and deliver services now that we know what they are? And I'll give you some examples of what those questions are in a more nuanced or more granular way in a little bit. I call these steering, enabling and enhancing, and making, and that's where SEAM comes from. So steering, enabling, enhancing, and making. And this model is fractal in nature. So it exists for the entire company. So if you have a company of 60,000 people, it exists on that whole macro level, but it may also replicate the same sets of concerns at a division level, at a department level, and to some extent even at a team level. So while at the whole company level, for all 60,000 people, you have some sense of what change we're trying to make in the world and who we want to be, that needs to be clarified again at the division level, at the department level. So I want to talk for a minute about systems, because this is the other thread, the really strong thread that goes into this. Is when I was developing this, I was also thinking a lot about systems, as I always do. And what is visible, what we can discern if we take a broader, longer look, and what we generally don't see as visible and aren't terribly aware of. So every organization has underlying structures that kick off the general dynamics of the organization. They show up in patterns. Patterns are visible or discernible if you look at data over a period of time. So they encompass the now, the near past, and the distant past. What we tend to get caught up in organizations is what's visible, the events, what is happening right now. But those events are generally the result of patterns that are emerged from the underlying dynamics. So this influenced my thinking about this in the following way, that the dynamics are generally established in the steering domain, and the patterns are the purview of the enabling enhancing domain, and the events, what we see in the now, show up in the making domain. So whatever dynamics are established in the steering domain and whatever patterns are engendered in how the enabling and enhancing domain address their concerns show up in the making. So this is why we get all sorts of issues showing up in teams that are not of the teams, right? They may have their origin in either enabling, enhancing, or even in steering, but they all show up there. So this exists without regard to hierarchy, even though the sort of triangle form does make it seem like it's hierarchical. They often map that way, particularly in larger companies. So in a larger company, it's very likely that the people who have most attention on steering are the senior leadership. Middle management pays attention to enabling, enhancing, and the team level or the frontline level is involved in the making domain. But it doesn't have to be that way. I know of some companies where everyone is involved in all of these decisions, right? Everyone attends to all three sets of concerns. Now, typically those are smaller companies, or they are smaller units within a larger company. So this doesn't require hierarchy, but it also doesn't dismantle hierarchy. It does tend to refocus people off that hierarchical orientation so that they're more focused, as I said, on making the parts and the whole work in a effective way, rather than, this is my lane, these are my people, these are my teams, and the competition that tends to be engendered with that. So this is a rather long quote from Donella Meadows, but it's one that I come back to a lot, in that for a system to function, the hierarchy has to balance. They have to balance the freedoms and responsibility of the subsystems and the total system. There has to be enough central control so that there can be coordinated and coherent action towards the larger system goal. But there also has to be enough autonomy that all parts of the organization can make decisions and take actions in the appropriate time at the appropriate speed with the appropriate contextual knowledge. So what we don't want, and what this model works against, is a separation of head and hands, which is just part of our legacy. It comes with the whole mechanistic and very hierarchical view of organizations. Nested within each of these domains, I think about clarity, conditions, and constraints. So clarity has to do with people knowing what they're working on. They know how their work fits into the big picture. So context, context, context. In traditional organizations, that context is very often stripped away. And when it is stripped away, people have little choice but to wait to be told what to do or to follow very detailed procedures, because they don't have the contextual knowledge to make good decisions. So how your work fits into the big picture, people know what to work on, that sort of clarity is super important. The conditions have to do with people having the means to do their work. So they actually have the environment that is supportive to collaboration, and organizational structures and policies support that. So if you say you want collaboration, you have job descriptions that support collaboration instead of supporting very individual achievement and just focusing on what one individual does. And constraints, we think about constraints in some ways as a bad thing, like they get in the way of flow. But from another perspective, constraints dampen flailing. So when people know what their constraints are, they know what should always be done, what should never be done. And that generally comes either in an articulated way or implicitly from the steering level when people determine, how we want to relate to our customers and how we want to relate to our employees. And very importantly, people can articulate their bounded autonomy. So very often when companies start talking about empowerment, they kind of, wave their hands and say people are going to be empowered. And either people don't quite know what that means, or they make a decision that they thought they were empowered to make, but it turns out they're not. And they get slapped down, which really works against empowerment. So since I'm sitting in my kitchen next to my next door neighbors, I'm going to tell you about them. They're lovely people. And when they moved in here, they had an invisible fence, which is one of those electric lines that you run around the perimeter of your yard, and your dog wears a shock collar so they get a shock if they try to go outside the fence. I personally think they're rather inhumane, but they're not illegal here. So they had one of these, but they were thinking about building a garage, so they didn't bury the wire. And it moved every time the wind blew. So it could move by 6 or 7 feet on a windy day. And those poor dogs just never knew when they were going to get a shock. So in a little more detail, this is how it plays out in an organization. So the steering is attending to the clarity of who are we, why are we, the relationships we want, our value proposition, how we make money, how our product's positioned. And when people throughout the organization know this, they can make much, much better decisions. They also deal with conditions. So the macro level organization, are we going to be a product organization organized around products? Are we organized around regions? Are we organized around some other scheme? Key policies about how we treat people, and then guiding principles, which often show up as values, which I don't generally find particularly useful. Those vague statements often get gamed, or they're so vague that no one could ever argue about against them. But guiding principles are simple rules that help people make judgments about actions and interactions across and at all levels, across many contexts and up and down throughout the organization. And I find that when those are consistent, it tends to build trust. When people at one level are treated very differently than people at the making level, it erodes trust quite quickly. I think it's also important to have sanctioned variation. The goal here is not to be consistent, the goal is to be coherent. So you can't anticipate from the top what every situation is going to be, what every piece of work is going to be like. So you need to think about what is the bounded variation. Sometimes I use the analogy of an oak. There are many species of oak, and you choose the particular species based on your environment. Some oaks grow better in dry conditions, some grow better in damp conditions. So on the enabling and enhancing domain, they're dealing with adaptive planning, priorities, trade-offs, formulating compelling goals, and problem finding. I think this is a super important thing for this domain to focus on, is to be looking across the organization and smoothing things out, looking systemically, taking a broad systemic look and working on those systemic issues. Cross-cutting issues, as I sometimes call them. So they're looking at creating the conditions for teams, lateral linking, which is often not a priority in traditional hierarchies, but how does this lateral linking happen between various groups in the organization? They facilitate those yours, mine, and ours decision conversations. So these are your decisions. You can make them within these boundaries. You don't have to talk to me. Decisions that for various reasons must remain with management, that usually has to do with budget or personnel issues, where they are actually legally acting as agents for the organization. And our decisions, which are ones we might make together. So bounded autonomy and transparency. And then on the making domain, it's local adaptive planning, local priority decisions, local problem finding, creating micro conditions within a team, which may include shared approaches, working agreements, and then lateral linking. So that's a little more detailed view about how it shows up at various parts of the organization. Now, I tend to go back to Jerry Weinberg's definition of leadership, which is leadership is the process of creating an environment in which people become empowered and in which everyone can contribute creatively to solving problems. So when you focus this way, it reinforces that the original purpose of a hierarchy is always to help the originating subsystems do their job better, right? And to do that, you need to create this environment where people can actually step into responsibility and step into creativity and step into innovation because they have that bounded autonomy and they have the context that helps them, that enables them to make reasonable decisions and to take reasonable actions without the need for constant supervision. If you think about leadership as the act of adjusting the environment so that everyone contributes to solving problems in the organization, this model, I think, really makes it actionable for people to think about how do we do that? How do we move in that direction?
Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, like the video, sign up for my channel, and visit my website to find out about upcoming webinars.